At 2:51 p.m. on Monday, October 19, 1959, a Boeing 707 registration number N7071 left Boeing Field for a demonstration and acceptance flight prior to the aircraft being delivered to Braniff International Airways. The estimated flying time for this training mission was 4 hours and 15 minutes. That morning, no one could have ever imagined that this flight would result in one of the most amazing and harrowing test flights you've never heard of. That's next on Maximus. Greetings everybody, Maximus here. I hope you are all doing well wherever you may be all across this great big world of ours. As always, if you haven't yet, make sure to hit that subscribe button and like us if you do. Before we get to the most amazing crash landing you've never heard of, I need to set the stage with what I think led to this terrifying incident, as well as another early Boeing 707 crash. For that, we need to go back 4 years before 1959. On Lake Washington, during the summer of 1955, Boeing had invited airline executives from all over the world for a day of fun and relaxation at the boat races at Lake Washington. Sales had been slow for the world's first commercial transatlantic long-haul jet, the 707. And Boeing knew if they were actually able to just show it off in person, they could generate interest in the plane from the decision makers firsthand. However, those decision makers on that day on Lake Washington didn't know they were going to be introduced to Boeing's Aviation world-changing airplane, but they were about to find out. And Boeing had the perfect guy to close the deal. Enter Boeing test pilot and World War II hero Alvin Tex Johnson. Johnson wasn't only a Boeing test pilot, he was also one hell of a salesman. Sure, he was told to just do a simple flyby over the lake to impress their guests. But Tex had been test flying the 707 under the code name of the Dash 80 for over a year, and he knew what a special aircraft it was and what it could do. So at the last minute, good old Tex called an audible. As he approached the lakeshore crowd at a relatively low altitude, Johnson performed a maneuver usually limited to smaller fighter jet aircraft commonly known as a barrel roll or a chandelle on the one and only 707 Boeing had at the time. Oh, and if that wasn't exciting enough, he also did one more barrel roll on the return trip back over the lake. I could tell you all about it, but why don't I let Tex tell you himself?
IATA, the International Air Transport Association, which includes all the airlines of the world, had assembled in Seattle for their annual convention. And Boeing just happened to have a prototype airplane that was going to shrink the world by a factor of 2. But I've sold fighters and commercial airplanes, and you demonstrate them to impress people what they're capable of. And I knew the prototype, and there's one maneuver that you can do with no hazard whatsoever. I decided that I would do a roll to impress the people. So I came across and did a chandelle. One of my test engineers happened to have his camera with him, and he snapped a picture, which is famous today, with the airplane on its back, and the engines up on top of the wing, and the Lake Washington below. I was called to Mr. Allen's office Monday morning, and Mr. Allen asked me what I thought I was doing, and I said I was selling airplanes. And explained it's a 1G maneuver, and it's absolutely non-hazardous, but it's very impressive. And his comment was, you know that now, we know that, but just don't do it anymore.
Needless to say, the gathered aviation executives in the crowd below were sold on the Boeing 707. Like I said, Tex was one hell of a salesman. Monday, October 19th, 1959 was a beautiful day for flying. Yet it was just another workday for Boeing's test pilots. Today's mission was to get pilots from Braniff Airlines familiar with their brand new state-of-the-art Boeing 707. The plane left Boeing Field at 2:51 p.m. for a standard demonstration acceptance flight prior to the aircraft being delivered to Braniff. The estimated flying time for the mission was 4 hours and 15 minutes. The crew of the flight consisted of Boeing test pilot Russell Baum and Braniff pilots John Burke and Frank Staley, as well as a Boeing flight engineer, George Hagan. Passengers on board were Boeing test pilot William Alsop, FAA Inspector William Hubner Jr., Albert Krause, Braniff flight engineer, and Fred Semanek, a Braniff maintenance engineer. After takeoff, Boeing's test pilot Russell Baum demonstrated several maneuvers which were duplicated by Braniff's Captain Burke, who was making his first flight in a 707. Next, Boeing test pilot Baum initiated a series of Dutch rolls at cruising speed in clean configuration. A clean configuration simply means that the flaps are retracted to demonstrate the proper method for recovery. A Dutch roll is an alternating yawing and rolling motion characteristic of a large swept-wing aircraft and can be caused by air turbulence or lateral over-control. Braniff's Captain Burke then executed several satisfactory Dutch roll recoveries from the left-hand seat. Boeing's test pilot Baum then slowed the aircraft to 155 knots or about 179 miles per hour. Baum also lowered the flaps 40 degrees and had Captain Burke make a series of recoveries from this configuration. Afterward, they traded positions so that Burke could practice recoveries from the right seat. During the right seat Dutch roll maneuvers, Baum allowed the 707 to bank more than 25 degrees in excess of the maximum limitations imposed by Boeing for the aircraft. Boeing passenger test pilot Alsop cautioned Baum about banking too steeply during the Dutch roll maneuver, but Baum ignored the warning. Baum then initiated another Dutch roll in which the aircraft's bank angle went from 40 to 60 degrees. Braniff's Captain Burke allowed the plane to complete several oscillations and then began recovery. However, during the roll recovery process, Burke's unfamiliarity with the process caused him to wildly overcorrect, causing the plane to roll to the right past 90 degrees, then abruptly back to the left, causing the brand new plane to enter a sudden graveyard spiral. This took place over North Snohomish County, Washington at about 12,000 feet. Boeing's Baum quickly took to the controls and restored the aircraft to level flight. But as some of the men went to the windows to survey the damage, they were horrified to see that 3 of the plane's 4 engines, along with their pylons, had been violently, physically ripped away from the wings due to the tremendous G-forces experienced during the reckless and over-exaggerated Dutch roll maneuvers. They also saw fire coming from the wings at the point where the engine's pylons were previously attached. After realizing the condition of their aircraft, the 4 non-flying passengers moved to the tail section and took brace positions for a wheels-up emergency landing. Unable to reach the airport at Arlington or Payne Air Force Base at Everett, Baum decided on a large open pasture between Arlington-Darrington Highway and the North Fork Stillaguamish River, approximately 1 mile west of the small farming community of Osso. But now there was another problem. Baum wasn't able to keep the wings level due to the torque from literally their one and only engine left. In order to keep the wings level, Baum made the unthinkable decision and shut down the remaining engine. With the plane still in one piece after surviving already unsurvivable odds, the crew began to have a glimmer of hope that they would actually make it safely back to Earth. It was looking good for a while. Baum originally had been the goat that caused the problem. Now maybe he could be the hero. However, during the dead stick approach, just feet from safety, the crippled 707 clipped a grove of tall trees just shy of the pasture and slammed onto the bank of the Stillaguamish River, causing the spilling jet fuel to ignite. The impact and resulting fire completely destroyed the forward section of the fuselage. The wreckage was strewn over several acres. The tail section broke away clean just behind the wings and landed in the middle of the river. Although badly damaged, the rear section of the airplane remained intact and all 4 passengers survived without serious injuries. They crawled out of the wreckage into the water and were helped up the riverbank by 2 men working nearby. Sadly, were it not for the extensive post-crash fire, the 4 pilots might have had a chance to survive the crash landing as well. The survivors suffering from shock and hypothermia were rushed to the Arlington General Hospital. During the night, the firefighters recovered the bodies of the 4 remaining victims. 3 were found in the smoldering cockpit and the 4th was pulled from the river. The following day, 1 engine was found in woods approximately 1 mile northwest of the crash site. A 2nd engine was found a mile from that engine in the same direction. On Monday, a week later, a helicopter pilot spotted the 3rd engine in the same general area. All three engines were found with major portions of their pylons still attached after having been wrenched from the plane's wings during the exceptionally violent Dutch roll maneuver. The fourth engine remained attached to the plane until the crash landing. None showed evidence of fire or malfunction prior to impact with the ground. The flight data recorder was recovered almost immediately. However, it had not been activated for the demonstration flight, so they had to rely mostly on testimony from the 4 survivors and witnesses on the ground. On Monday, June 20th, 1960, the Civil Aeronautics Board, now known as the NTSB, released its aircraft accident report. The board determined that the probable cause of the accident was the structural failures of 3 of the 4 engine pylons caused by an improper recovery attempt from a Dutch roll maneuver that exceeded the bank angle and G-force limits of the aircraft. In its press release, they said it could find no valid reason for Mr. Baum's initiating the final Dutch roll so violently. No training advantage could be gained by conducting these maneuvers at the extreme bank angle reached. Those lost in the crash were Boeing test pilot Russell Baum, Braniff pilot John Burke, Boeing flight analyst George Hagen, and Braniff pilot Manlif Staley. Survivors were Boeing test pilot William Alsop, FAA inspector William Hubner, Braniff flight engineer Albert Krause, and Braniff flight instructor Fred Semanek. This was the second such accident involving a Boeing 707 since the jet was put into commercial service with Pan Am Airlines in October of 1958. The first mishap occurred on Saturday, August 15, 1959, when 5 crew members were killed on a training flight aboard an American Airlines Boeing 707-123 near the Peconic River Airport at Calverton, New York. According to the airport accident report, the crash was caused by an unintentional rolling maneuver at an altitude too low to permit a complete recovery. So now I think you can see why I began this video with the amazing skills and showmanship of Boeing test pilot Captain Tex Johnston. His barrel roll was seen all around the world, and I think that test pilot Russell Baum was definitely inspired by Tex Johnston when he thought he would have some fun showing off for Braniff pilots in the skies over Washington that tragic day. As far as for the second crash in New York, there are conflicting ideas as to whether the pilots in that case were also fooling around when the plane began to roll while on their training mission, or if the plane just got away from them and they lost control. And one last Tex story before we go. A few years later, Tex was a passenger on a commercial 707 flight. While at 35,000 feet, the plane began to get into a similar Dutch rolling situation the 707 was famous for. After a few minutes of watching his fellow passengers turn green and queasy, old Tex began to mosey on up to the cockpit. Well, old Tex knocked and walked in and introduced himself and said, "Hey fellas, need a hand?" Well, both pilots, now a similar shade of green as the rest of the passengers, welcomed Tex's assistance. The nauseous captain gave up his seat immediately, and Tex sat down in the left chair. And with a few fingers on each hand, he made a little yoke adjustment, and the plane stopped rolling just like that. Then Tex went back to his seat. I like to imagine he had a cigarette and a scotch and probably a nap, because after all, he was Tex Johnston. I have to admit, I never heard about this amazing crash landing until I started doing research for another video. I'm really anxious to hear how many of you actually have heard about this incident before. Let me know down below. And as always, be sure to subscribe, like, share, and ring the bell. And remember, leave the rubber on the runway and your troubles on the ground. And I will see you next time in the air. Yeah, this is Maximus.